From your left, Steve Smith is the Director of Physical IT Network for Arvest Bank Operations, has a wealth of experience. He's a facilities guy in the IT department. In the center, Steve Hawley is the Data Center Manager for the Medical College of Wisconsin. He's an IT guy with a lot of experience on the facilities side and a lot of interesting perspective. And finally, our moderator, Jeff Gilmer, is Senior Partner for Excipio Consulting, and he's done a ton of work in this field. It's going to be a great session. As Wendy said, we encourage questions, comments, observations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Okay. Thank you, Ed. Good morning, everyone. So what we're going to go through is we've got 4 topics that we've kind of picked out here. We'll bring up each of the topics. We'll talk a little bit about them. I'll kind of start out each topic, and then I'll turn it over to Steve and Steve here. Make sure they know which Steve I'm referring to when I get there, but I'll take care of that. But we'll let them provide a little bit of kind of their experience with the different things we're going to talk about and what they really see in the real world and what has happened within their organizations. And then after each one of those sections, we'll stop, and if you have some questions, we'll take questions, and then we'll move on to the next slide. So this will be interactive. We encourage you to save your questions until we finish each slide. Be sure to bring up a couple and we'll address them. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have some time if there are additional questions as well. So our first topic is impacts of new applications and compute infrastructure. And there's several different questions that you can see up here that I'm sure many of you have encountered in your daily activities. You know, do servers and storage ever show up unannounced to you from a facility standpoint? Do you need to ever look at the implementation of new business products and services that catch you off guard in the data center? You know, maybe you don't have enough power, maybe you don't have enough cooling, maybe you didn't expect it from a space standpoint, maybe it's a security standpoint of it, from that type of thing. What about the issues of virtualization or high density equipment? And, you know, I'll give you an example. One client we worked with had 74 racks of equipment, 13 servers per rack. When we finished optimizing them, we put all 74 racks into one server. We had 1,200 servers in one rack. Huge impact on power, huge impact on cooling, huge impact on space, okay? So those are the types of things that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to let Steve and Steve each kind of give you their input here, and then we'll stop in a few minutes for any questions. So Steve Smith, why don't you go ahead and kind of talk a little bit about what you've experienced.
Well, the first bullet point here regarding servers and storage devices showing up unannounced really goes back to the fact that we appear as a country to have lost everything that we learned in kindergarten. The first thing you learn in kindergarten, how to work and play well with others, communicate with one another. When you work with a team, and I'm in IT, but I'm a facility manager, so I don't actually specify and procure the equipment in the compute environment, but I am responsible to make sure that it gets on the raised floor whenever it does arrive. Planning and development generally for us starts in budget season, which we're in right now. I know through communications with the other directors that are responsible for procurement of that equipment, what's going to come in and when it's going to come in, because we have to budget by month. Banking industry may be a little bit different. We've got to be able to say what we're going to spend in every month, and then we've got to hit that mark. But when you start at the budget season, figuring out what is going to hit and when it's going to hit, it allows you to budget for data center infrastructure. And a lot of that really comes down to communication and building a relationship with the people that are in the other areas. Does anybody here ever go to a team meeting in another area? Or you pretty much stay to yourself? You do? It's a great way to find out what's going on in someone else's area. Other managers at first may be kind of standoffish because, well, who's this individual coming to my meeting? But when you come in and you preface it with the fact that I want to make sure that we work together and that everything that we are doing is aligned with the goals and objectives of the company, and my job primarily is to make sure that you're successful, it's much better received.
So, quick question for you, Steve. When you talk about those key members, who are some of the key members from facilities or IT when you get into that budgeting or you get into those discussions? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. The key members for budgeting for us is we have a director who's responsible for network telecom and the server infrastructure environment. So he has different managers that roll up under him that will specify, I'm going to have so many servers this year based on my request load from my customers. Network engineering gets that information, fortunately inside of the same group, trying to build the network infrastructure to make sure that that matches what's going to be coming in. And then the telecom folks, as we grow as a company, there are different things, teleconferencing, telephones on desks, things like that, that all have to be taken into consideration from a network perspective, and that requires a gear on the raised floor. We're a voice over IP shop primarily, so those groups, as long as you're working together, work and play well with others. You have got to have a relationship, and you've got to have communication. A lot of times, IT and facilities gets into this headbutting sort of a relationship where I'm not going to talk to that person. Last time I tried to put something on the floor, they threw their hands up. How come you didn't let me know this was coming? Well, occasionally you get those one-off things that are a surprise delivery. It happens. By and large, you should be planning those things, but your reaction when they do show up can make or break the relationship and the ability to plan for the future.
Okay. Steve Hawley, would you like to give a little bit from your perspective? I know we talked about you're going through kind of an application discussion right now.
Yes, we are. We're going to be moving from IDX for our medical billing to Epic. So that transition, we had a brief discussion on what is that going to take us for hardware? How do we do our disaster recovery for that? And I'm bringing already the facilities people into that discussion. I'm on the IT side, so I'm responsible for the application and all the hardware that runs it, but they provide me the power and the cooling in our data centers. I coordinate that with the facilities people. We have some pretty defined roles, but one of the things we did is draw some pretty distinct lines. Well, who's responsible for what? They do the UPSs and they do the cooling, but from the power, from the distribution PDUs to the cabinet, I take care of that with them being fully aware of what we're doing. In other words, are they 5K cabinets, 8K cabinets, or in the case of our high-performance compute clusters, we've got some 23K cabinets running in a fully a chimney. It's the topmost, if you will, of containment, where we have hot, cold aisles, and then we have cabinets that are contained, and then the heat goes up to a return plenum above the ceiling. So they need to be aware of that because that changes the dynamics of the airflow. So it's very important that those, even down to the technicians that work on the crack units, are aware of any changes that are coming. We went through that virtualization. We talked about that. We went all in into virtualization when we were almost out of space in the data centers. Virtualization saved the day. We've got now 400 servers in one cabinet. It does produce a little bit different situation. You get a hotter spot. You have to plan for that. That makes a 6-year-old data center where we had to redo some things and we had to change some of the design. Mm-hmm. So it's, we talked a bit about lifespan issues, and I think we're going to talk about that later on, but where facilities is buying crack units. I have some crack units that are going on 10 years old, and UPSs we run till 15 years old, but certainly any of my IT equipment is now being refreshed in a 3 to 5 year cycle. Our life cycle management, once the contracts are not cost effective anymore, which even on storage is changing drastically. As I went to more and more virtualized servers and gaining space, at the same time I saw our storage exploding. I had 13 to 17 cabinets all of a sudden of hard disk drives. That now, with SSD drives and our new NetApp and EMC storage, is down to a couple of cabinets. So that, again, is doing a similar thing. Those smaller footprints, those smaller physical footprints, brings a higher heat and density for power, producing some problems for that.
And that's probably a pretty common trend. I would assume most of you are seeing where your servers are shrinking when it comes to physical servers. So from a power and cooling standpoint, you may have certain areas that are higher density, but your overall requirements related to power and cooling are probably dropping. But yet storage is the one area that continues to increase. So from an IT perspective, that's the conversation, as Steve brought up here, that you need to be having with your facilities people. So from you and a facility standpoint can understand, it may not be that you're changing your power or cooling, it may be where it's being used, or how you're distributing it, or how you're allocating it, or where it's going to go and be used within your data center itself. So from that perspective. Do we have any questions in relationship to working between IT and facilities? Do you have any questions for Steve or Steve that you'd like to address? So I don't know if that mic is loud, but the question is, why did he separate at the PDUs rather than at the rack from a power standpoint? For Steve Hawley.
Essentially, our electricians, and we have electricians at the medical college, don't want to mess with the cabinets at all. They don't want to go into any of the IT cabinets. So with the infrastructure I have for distribution of power, we use end of row UPS A, UPS B on either side, feeding the redundant power to each and every cabinet. It's done with whips and breakers. It's an APC modular transformerless PDU, distribution PDU with 24 slots. It's simple enough for us. We were doing it hot, although now there's been some changes to the laws where because of the 240 volts, APC is telling us we need to shut that off. But I can tell you I've literally done hundreds of them with the units up and powered up. The breakers are hot pluggable. You run the whip to the cabinet, you plug in the PDU. It literally takes me longer, or my tech longer, to make the labels. And we label everything at every end as to which UPS it is, what position in that modular panel. Put that on the end, which I call the plug. It's kind of a Hubble connector. It's a very robust electrical connection. And then on the PDU itself. And then we use colored locking power cables inside of the cabinets for quick identification in case of a outage or in case of a routine maintenance where we take one side down so that we know what's plugged in where. Not to mention my DSIM solution also tracks the power right to the breaker level. So every breaker has a one-on-one relationship with that PDU. That got to be an IT thing where I sat down with facilities and they said, we're going to draw the line there. You guys sound like you got that all set up. We'll take care of all of the power up to there. If there's a short in a cabinet that trips a breaker, if there's no power on that PDU, that's for us to take a look at. And then I either take care of it or I have APC in to service that. Literally, we've only tripped one breaker, and that was a dead short in a power supply and a chimney controller board. That's the only breaker I've seen tripped in 12 years of using this infrastructure.
I think
Steve Smith,
demarcation is very
where's yours at?
cultural, honestly. I think if we surveyed the room, we'd probably find out that people draw that line in various places. And if you sat down and talked with folks that had been at the company the longest, you'll likely find out, because that's the way we've always done it. Not that it couldn't change, not that you couldn't find a more applicable, a more user-friendly way to find where that line is. I own from the utility service all the way into the server. I own rack and stack. If it gets plugged into power, if it gets plugged into network, my staff plugs it in. If it gets taken out of a rack, my staff unplugs it. Obviously, there's certain components of gear that get installed by a third party, and that's kind of where my ownership has to end, right? You've got to be willing to work with those folks that are going to bring in S400, mainframe, disk storage, various pieces of equipment that if you want a warranty on it, they're going to bring in their people and assemble it in place in your facility, or you give up that feature. And utilizing those resources, working closely with the vendors and with the equipment owners is very important. We want to make sure that we're supporting the goals and objectives of the company because our culture is customer service first. So whenever you're dealing with these other areas, oftentimes there will be that headbutting relationship that we were talking about earlier. That's mine, that's not yours. When I talk about ownership, that's an ownership that says, this is what I agree to take care of. I'm going to take care of it in the best way possible. And you don't have to worry about getting pulled in at the last second to save me. Not that I might not ask for help if I need it, but we're going to draw a line in the sand and say, I own this. You're not going to wind up with it dropped in your lap one day because we just don't want it anymore. We're taking a lot of things on that used to be inherent to our server engineering staff and our network engineering staff, and folks would come down, and change management becomes much easier because I own the installation on the raised floor. That means nobody else needs access to the room. The only reason you have to go in is if there's a need to physically repair a device. If you're going to replace a hard drive, change out memory, got a bad power supply, then you put in a change, you gain access to the room, you do that thing. Rack and stack doesn't sneak in on you. You know, have somebody coming down there that says, oh, while I'm at it, I'll just go ahead and put this in a rack. All right? How many times has that happened to us? Because we don't have control of the room. I think there might be a question in the back, sir.
Yes, sir. Is there a specialized process for single-corded devices?
We do have a special process for single-corded devices. We use, our UPS modules are set up so that we feed a static switch, and then from the static switch, we feed a single-corded device. We discourage the purchase of single-corded devices. However, there are certain things that we use, they really only come that way. Now that contingent or that quantity of equipment in the raised floor becomes smaller and smaller every year. Vendors are getting on board with the concept of the redundant power supply and the idea that their customers really want those.
Yeah, thank you. I was also, are they mapped presently, or is there a?
They are. We're in a real small room, so we're using the good old Excel spreadsheet method, and it works for us. It's not something that I want to continue on. We're currently growing our data center footprint, and we would be expanding into a product to manage those. And the goal, yes, is to map not only the power connections back to PDU and back to UPS level, but also to map the network connections and the fiber connections back to their distribution locations and to the primary entrance to the building so that we know we have our redundancy correct.
Good. I think we have one more question over here.
It would be great, as you mentioned, if you could poll the room to see from the PDU down if it's IT usually takes responsibility for that.
Okay, so let's just do a quick show of hands. From the PDU down, when is who in here is IT responsible for? So probably a quarter of the room. So I assume the rest of you facilities is responsible for that. Is that correct? So it's probably 25-75. That's what it looks like.
And you know what, Jeff? I would think that may depend on what your distribution is, on whether it's a bus above or hardwired. One of my data centers was 1980 vintage, and when I started, everything was conduit under the floor, taking up valuable cooling space in my 2-foot raised floor.
Yes.
When I ripped that out, I cannot believe the amount of cooling and hot spots that I eliminated. But when I saw the pile, the dumpsters full of 6-inch channels that they were putting down in there, somebody didn't understand what the raised floor was all about. It wasn't to put down wires and plumbing and pipes and to store old tiles too.
Exactly.
That's what was in it.
I will tell you,
Who owns that responsibility and who gets held accountable when things fail because there's not enough airflow to take care of the building?
Exactly. I will tell you, we do many data center assessments with our organization. And when we have our people going in, our consultants, to assess a data center, the first thing they do is they start pulling floor tiles to see what's underneath there. And you would be amazed at what has been found. Everything from water to mice to all the things you would see under there, from spaghetti wires and everything else, and you wonder why there are cooling issues. So,
Found a shower cap under one of our floors.
a
one
shower
time.
cap, haven't found that yet.
Not sure where that one came from. Local hotel, but beyond that, we really don't know.
I don't know
Okay.
if the cleaning service is here at this conference, but I had it professionally cleaned, and they had estimated 6 hours with 3 people to do that data center. It took them 2 days, and they had everything from concrete blocks to soda cans to coffee cups to cigarette butts.
It happens.
It was
Yeah.
under the floor.
Control of access to the raised floor and who's going in there and why they're going in there is very important. And any of you that work for companies that are publicly held, there's a lot of backlash when things go down.
Yep, and we'll
if
actually
you're not
talk about
properly
that.
taking care of that, you're running a risk, not only internally but externally. Because when someone has an outage and they lose sales, generally stock prices tumble. It becomes a negative impact to the company overall. It's going to impact your budget long term.
There is a
because
plus to
they
that,
don't
though.
foresee
You do
that.
get funding then all of a sudden. When we
You do
had our first
rapidly get
disaster.
funding, but it is negative funding. It is
Yeah.
not the kind of funding you want to get.
Ed, we have one more question, Ed. We'll take one more, and then we'll move on to the next slide here.
So I'm curious, since we talked about the PDU down being IT and everything else is facilities, what about under the floor? Is that facilities, or is that, do you consider that the IT?
Did you say under the floor?
Yeah, if it's not under the floor, so I think the question is, if it's no longer under the floor, where is that breakdown between IT and facilities? Or is that what you're asking? Or what, under the floor? Okay, under the floor, is it IT or facilities? Did I get it right? There, that's what he's asking. How do you define that?
For under the floor, for me, what that means is a cold air duct. We have one hard floor data center where I don't even have to deal with the raised floor. The other one is the cold air space underneath the floor now, because all of the wiring, low voltage data, fiber, is overhead in the cabinets, as is the power distribution from these whips and breakers. Everything is above. So it's only cold air, and that is a facility function. They take care of the cracks, they take care of the maintenance on those units, preventative maintenance, as they do on the UPSs and the power distribution equipment short of those end of row PDUs.
Okay.
So that's where our line is. And we blurred that a little bit in that, and I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I wanted to make this point. For years, we had trouble scheduling our biannual PM checks for UPSs. Oh, we can't do this during the day. We've got an Oracle upgrade. This is end of month. We're doing this processing. It was always something. And I could see the frustration, hear the frustration from the maintenance guys. We can't even schedule this. You're constantly telling us you can't do it, you can't do it. I said, look, I'll take over scheduling that. I picked September and March, months that we're not likely to have weather, where people are going to be nervous that, oh boy, we're going to be on grid power, even though it's only only one of the 2 power supplies. I started doing that scheduling. It produced 2 things. It took that off of their plates. They're just happy to have me schedule it and get it done. But it also helped me train my IT community that these are the months that it's done. They're used to that. They know that it's going to be done at that time, and nothing has been happening. So that calmed down all of the naysayers. Where I used to get 10 emails and it was very difficult scheduling that. If I get 1 or 2 emails now, well, it doesn't affect us anyways, but thanks for letting me know. So I kind of set up the maintenance, but that very big budget hit of paying for that stuff is out of the facility budget, not out of the IT budget. They are responsible for the power to us and the cooling for that room.
Which kind of leads to our next question, financial impacts. He's talking about budgeting. So I'll kind of preface this a little bit. If you take a look at it from the facility side, and you look at the life cycle of some of the equipment, a generator might have a 30-year life cycle. The physical structure of the building might be 30 years. A crack unit might be 10 years. A UPS system might be 7 to 10 years. Then you go to the compute side, the life cycle might be 3 years on some of the storage equipment or some of the servers, or 5 years. So it creates kind of a conflict, is what we end up seeing, between when we're upgrading the data center versus when we're upgrading the compute equipment. And if we're going to make a decision on upgrading a data center, migrating a data center, the compute people want to move some things to the cloud, the financial ramifications become important. And typically the CFO is getting involved in those decisions. And you may be in a situation where you have to stay longer in a particular facility to get the life out of it, even maybe though IT wants to move. Or IT may have to hold off on refresh until the facility side can get money in their budget or their funding to upgrade for more power or more cooling. So I'm going to kind of open it up that way. And Steve Smith, why don't we start with you a little bit, because I know you've dealt with some of that.
Yeah, we're currently in a facility it's kind of locked. It's a basement style facility, so expansion in place is kind of tough. We've had a lot of consolidation and virtualization, which is good and bad, because it takes that spread out many servers component, puts it in a single rack, which is now high density. So you've got to be able to figure out how to get cooling to it. But if you're planning the deletion of the other servers with the implementation of the new ones with the manager, director, whoever's responsible for that equipment, generally you can readjust your airflow to this new condition and profile you need. We use static pressure sensors under the raised floor. I try to maintain as high a static pressure as I can so I can deliver cold air to top of a rack. And that single thing has, along with ceiling openings in the raised floor, has really helped us to be able to deal with that. But absolutely, we want to get as much out of our assets as possible, and I think everybody does. So you're going to have a certain drive to replace equipment on a technology refresh basis, because energy is better on newer pieces of equipment. As technology evolves, the work per watt that you're going to get out of it is better. The things that the company can use it for, it becomes faster. You can support your customers better, back to customer service. Really, the equipment life cycle of the compute hardware, it can get you into a place where you wind up having 50% of your rack units utilized and 100% of your UPS. It's not an uncommon thing. As we build out, we learn from these things, and we try to make a lot of our facilities more modularly expandable. We'll get into a situation where we can put in a certain amount of raised floor, and as we grow, we'll add a UPS module. We'll add a generator as we need it. Once we get to the point that in our planning that we have not only used up all of our rack units, but also our UPS capacity, if you can do that evenly, you have really done your job well. That is probably the number one battle that we face.
Steve, would you like to share a little bit, Steve Hawley, on your side? I know we talked a little bit about this, that you've gone through that change of the servers and the others on your end, and how much of that, I think you talked a little bit about when you can control some of the maintenance and the funding of the maintenance versus facilities, and kind of how those budgets are shared.
Yes. As I said, they take care of the contracts on my UPSs, and I do the scheduling for them. I do let them know, and they're keenly aware of what percentage we're at all 6 of our mission-critical UPSs, so that we know when we're looking at upgrading. It's not a surprise. We also have quarterly meetings where we put down things like battery replacements, which on our Eaton units are in the $27,000, $28,000 range. APCs a little bit more, because I've got modular APC units. Now they're at 10 years old, they're requiring a revitalization. So that's, I will get those quotes together from our APC sales, and we'll talk about that in our quarterly meetings, so that we have this in a spreadsheet type form, but where everybody's on the same boat, where we know how much power we have left out of the design of what the data center was to be, and then there is no surprises as we are talking about, well, you know what, we're going to put in a couple more storage cabinets, and our backup has kind of grown to being 6 cabinets full of equipment. That's now more cabinets than the storage, where because of the consolidation and the density of our storage, we've got more cabinets in the pods that back it up to tape. So yes, talking back and forth and making sure that there's budget for not only the equipment that's coming in, but to cool it, to put it in a spot that has room for it, for space, for the weight of it, and to cool it properly.
Okay. So a quick question for the audience that we have here, out of curiosity. How many of you have a single budget for IT and data center facilities? So your funds roll up into one budget. Just a quick show of hands. Okay. So there's a few. And how many then have separate IT budget from a separate data center facilities budget? I'm assuming that's pretty much the rest of you. Okay? So those of you that just raised your hands in the second half, that's the traditional way. Those of you who raised your hands earlier, that's where it's headed. So just be aware of that in the industry. You're going to find that you're going to have to work more and more together with the facilities related specifically to the data center facilities, okay, not if it's other building facilities, with the IT people to understand that funding and that budget together. I think that's something you should look for in the future and expect to see in the future within the industry. Do we have any questions related to funding or budgeting at this point? Gentleman over here? So I'll just readdress the question everybody can hear. So the question is, how soon do you understand from the budget and procurement processes of when new equipment is going to be procured, when it's potentially going to arrive, and when you need to be prepared for it? Is that summary? Yes.
So that's a great question, and it was one of the things back to the company cultures that I've been in the past, and the one that I'm in now really plays a lot into, because we used to have things in one of my past positions that would just show up. Well, it takes 90 days to procure anything. Nothing just shows up tomorrow because you got the PO today. So if you're in a position where you don't have the communication with the folks that are ordering that equipment, get some communication with the purchasing department. All I'm asking for is a copy of the PO. I don't care if it has a number on it. I want to know what it is, where it is, and when it is. You get that coming to you, all of a sudden you can get ahead of that curve. I know when things are coming because I have a good relationship with the manager that takes care of IT infrastructure. I have physical infrastructure, which means I own the structured cabling piece of it. They have the IT infrastructure, which means they own the physical compute device. They're very good about making sure I know when something is coming. Sometimes things slip through, but I also find out about those because I have a great relationship with IT finance and with purchasing. Whenever something does get ordered for the data center, I get a copy of that PO. I know what the lead time is on it because it's on there. It's part of the stated agreement. I know when it's going to hit the dock. I'm prepared for it. I take ownership of it. Some of this involves reaching out to other teams, and you have to be the bigger individual sometimes, because not always will those other folks want to talk to you about it. You're in my business. Get out of my business. I'm not in your business. I'm in our business. We have to have a relationship that says we can work closely enough together to make both of us successful, or we're both going to be out on the street looking for another spot, right? So it can be difficult to get that across to people. A lot of folks are, that's mine, don't touch it. But moving our data center cost centers, all of the things that, all those expenses to one centralized cost center so that we know what it costs to operate the data center was a great move for us. Originally, we had home office maintenance that was also part of IT facilities. Everybody's got access to the room there. They take care of paint and patch. They take care of light bulb changes. I mean, we're still involved with them. They still have the ability to come in, but we have that mutual relationship understanding of ownership. Who owns what? How are we going to do it? Get a process in place. And when you go to talk to folks about, I want to improve our relationship, I want to improve how we're doing business, you have to start by getting your house in order. Because if you have problems, if you're not customer service centered, and you go talk to people about, I need you to work with me better, The first response, well, you don't do this, and you don't do that, and you don't do the other, but you want me to change? Get your stuff in order first. Make sure that you're customer service centered, and go and offer yourself as a resource to help them be successful. And back to kindergarten, work and play well with others.
Steve Hawley, you want to add any comment to how you work with procurement? You're kind of coming from the other side.
Yes. All about at the PO time, be notified via email or through our ticketing system. We'll also have the owner of that equipment create a ticket in Sharewell. We'll track it through that so it can move through the various teams, network, me and operations and data centers, where I can actually bring up my DCO and decide where it's going to be racked before it ever even shows up. That kind of keeps us from what we were at just not too long ago, where the stuff would sit in the hall until we'd start walking around figuring things out. And, well, we have space here, but we don't have cooling, we don't have the power. Oh, there's no network for what we need for that. The ticketing and tracking it that way has solved that for the most part, where when it comes in, we are confident that we will be able to deploy that in a timely fashion.
Yep, and you may not think this happens. It happens. We just, there's a client that we just finished working with. $10 million EMC storage device was purchased. 18 months later, it was installed because they did not have the funds to provide the power and cooling for the storage system.
That ticketing component is a great point also. Pretty much everybody in here, your organization, use a ticket system, like a Sharewell or a Remedy or something along that line. Those are all queryable. If somebody puts in a ticket to buy something or to install something, maybe they don't put you on it, but you can run a search.
Yep.
And you can set up standardized searches that just deliver to your email. And when those things pop up, bam, you get a copy of it, you know. And you get the opportunity to go down there and say, hey, Frank, Bob, Sue, Sally, whatever, saw you ordered this, want to get in front of it. How can I make sure that we're going to get it on the floor in time? Give me the specifications.
Okay, let's move on to our next topic. So a little bit about monitoring, management, and security. So kind of the differences here. If you're coming from the facility side, for security, you're probably looking at physical security, access management, maybe video, cameras, something along those lines, and maybe monitoring around a DCIM type of tool. If you're coming from the IT side, you're thinking more of it in the digital security side of it, right? Firewalls, hacking through the internet, or other aspects that come through. However, let's take an example of where they cross over. You've got video cameras out there and you're storing video. Well, that video is being stored through servers and storage that IT probably takes care of. So you have to have some collaboration between the two. So I'm going to open it up a little bit. Actually, Steve Hawley, I'm going to start with you because you're in the process, I think, of implementing a DCIM type of tool and going through that. So why don't you start out a little bit?
Well, we do our monitoring on the IT side with a DSIM product, and that gives me full visibility and alert emails for temperature, power. Every one of my PDUs is metered and monitored. Where it used to be an electrician would come to me and say, well, I got a breaker on the wall that's so hot I can't touch it, and I didn't even know what cabinet it was. That is not acceptable any longer at the densities and the mission critical systems that we have in those data centers, where if we're down, it shuts down the whole institution. We had to move to something where we have visibility of that. I have that right down to my closets with the single phase UPSs that keep edge switches in those closets up. Also gives me the important temperature thing that's going to be an issue coming. The power over Ethernet on those switches in those closets are cooking my batteries in the UPSs. It's become a nightmare for my guys that are doing the physical wiring. They are in charge of those closets. I'm aware of the problem. I get that the temperatures are too high in those rooms. Taking my battery life in those UPSs down to under a year in some cases. So we're going to have to cool those closets. So those things, sometimes the monitoring points out problems that you weren't even aware you had. We knew those rooms were hot. We didn't know that it's going to be affecting expensive Cisco switches that now we can't afford to have that switch go down. It's not just you can't log on to your computer. You don't have a phone. The power over Ethernet is for the phones. It's for the wireless. Wireless is huge in our networking department. Every student has 3 devices. We have access points everywhere. So sometimes you need to do that type of monitoring, and it points out problems that is nice to know that you have, but you then have to act on them. It's kind of a double-edged sword, if you will.
Yep, before you go, Steve. Again, the increase of high-density compute equipment compounds this problem, right? The higher density, the higher power demands, you know, the more equipment per cabinet. It's great from the IT side, but it does create issues for us on the facility side. If you're not monitoring or managing that, it can catch you off guard.
Security for, obviously, a bank is of paramount importance. It's one of our #1 focuses, and we've got a separate physical security department and a network security department, but we consider ourselves joined at the hip, as it were. My staff can destroy all the security measures that physical security and network security takes if they choose to. It's a huge responsibility. I make sure they understand the responsibility and the differences. So you've got to get work done, right? Sometimes you're going to bring contractors in a different door, and that door's got to get propped open. Security is willing to work with us. They'll bring a guard down, they'll put with that door so that we've got the continuity of, we know who went in, we know why they went in, and what they did while they were in there. Everybody remains escorted. If I have a power provider or a cooling systems technician that's going to go in and do some work, never in the raised floor by themselves. Nobody ever, in our current environment, we do have power distribution and cooling on the raised floor, as opposed to a gallery setup, which is our preferred future method, where you would keep those individuals out of the room to start with. But the fact that we're paying attention to that security and we're building a building with security in mind, it gives a lot of peace of mind to the folks that are ultimately responsible and accountable to ensure that the building is physically and network secure. You can't have people just come into the raised floor and plug anything in. You have to have that control. Whenever someone needs access to the raised floor, I sign off on it first. Physical security signs off on it second. We never have a situation where either one of us can roll something in or a person in and nobody knows about it and nobody knows what's going on. So we're very tightly connected, even though we're separate entities. And I don't think that we should really be the same entity, because there's accountability in that separation. This network security is responsible to take care of the integrity of the network, and if I compromise it, well, they don't work for me, so there's no coercion there that says, well, it was the boss, he did that. Or they don't work with me because Steve's my friend, so we're not going to deal with anything because, we're buddies. That accountability is very important, and it makes sure that your company is run cleanly, and that anybody that's looking in from an audit perspective has 100% clarity on who owns what got done, why it got done, and if there's anything that needs to change, who owns that change.
Okay. So kind of a question for the room again. It's the bottom one here. Who is responsible for documentation meeting security requirements? What I'd like to ask, and I'll tell you, it's one thing that our company, it's one of the first things that we look at when we go to do a data center assessment. We look at access. We look at who has access, how many people have access, where do they have access to, how well is it controlled? So my question for you is this: how many in this room actually have a list and know all the people that have access to your data center? Okay, that's pretty good. Because I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of people we talk to that have no idea. We go in there and realize you have 85 people that have access to your data center? And they go, huh? And they look at it and we start to go through it when you really probably should have 15 or maybe 10 or maybe others. So it's good that you have that. But that is one thing that you want to check. The other thing is, if you use key cards, how many people use key cards for access to their data centers? Okay? So where's your master key card for programming that access? Do you know? Because if you don't know, whoever has that, we found that some people have no idea that that key card is still floating out there when it was programmed, and anybody can use that to gain access to your data center. That should be locked up somewhere, and you know where that card is. Just a couple of hints for you from a facility standpoint, from a security
Who
standpoint.
still
So,
has physical keys to the data center?
yeah.
Where do those reside?
Do you have physical keys rather than a key card? I'm sure some people have gone to
Are they-
biometrics as
Or
well.
they do
and-
not
Biometric,
duplicate
yes.
keys? Or does everybody, hey, I got a key, go get you one made at Walmart?
Okay, any questions about monitoring management security from the audience? Particular questions? Gentleman over here?
Are vendors escorted, break fix vendors, so they escorted within the data centers doing work and so like?
100% of the time, my staff, I own it.
Okay.
Yes, we do also.
So I'll add a little input to that. So one of the things that we do from our organization is we do operational compliance reviews of data center. So we're looking at things like meeting HIPAA requirements, meeting criminal justice, CJIS requirements, IRS requirements, PCI requirements, PII requirements, you go through that. Well, all of those are different on whether they have to be escorted or not, even down to the cabinet level and who can access certain cabinets and racks and others, right? So if any of those criteria fall within your organization, you need to understand them and work with your IT people to know it might be that these Cat 3 cabinets are isolated because they have criminal justice information, CJIS information in the public sector, and only these two people can touch them. I mean, it's literally to that degree when you start to understand some of that.
And
And
to
s-
tag on to that answer that I gave, oftentimes we will request a person from the department responsible for that gear because my staff doesn't necessarily know, is that vendor doing what they're supposed to be doing? What did they come in there to do? Power supply work? Why is he putting media in the server? Somebody got some tag-along work going on? Is it a situation where somebody's trying to put some skimming in place? It's and skimming for banking, if you don't know, is just a huge, huge deal right now.
Yeah, some of the regulatory and financial implications that you face
Yeah.
are there, and not only there, but yours in a medical college as well, with the
Yes.
data that you handle,
Right.
and the data that everybody handles today with the HIPAA data. You know, you need to know what data that particular server, what data is on that particular storage rack, even before that break fix really touches it. You should
Right.
know to that degree, to be
Yeah.
honest, if you have any of those compliance requirements.
We have internal audit and external audit, and we are under audit constantly. Part of life in the business. You never want to have to answer the question, what was individual XYZ doing in the floor on this date at this time? You don't want to have to answer that. I don't know. Somebody's got to know. And you've got to know, if it's not you, you got to know who that is. And it's really good to also know what they're doing, what they're supposed to be doing. The more, I'm not going to call it control, I'm going to call it engagement. The more engaged you are with the things that are going on in your environment, regardless of if you're IT or facilities, safer your business is going to be, the better your level of customer service is going to be, the better your long-term success of your company.
Okay. Any other questions on this one? Another one? Yes?
Just a follow-up, and so is there a review of the or approval of the tickets that people use to get in the room before they get in?
Absolutely.
Is there a review of the tickets that people use to get in the room?
Yep. So the ticketing process that we have, there are different levels of change. Everybody probably has something similar, depending on the impact that is expected from the change. It may be a manager only. It may be a manager and director. It may be a manager and 2 directors that have to sign off on it. If it's potentially impacting, I mean, probably 90% of our changes are manager and 2 directors. So there are always at least 3 people in command who are in agreement that we need to do this.
Okay. Any others? Okay. Move on to kind of our last topic here. Engineering. Talking about engineering. Are solutions ever over-engineered or under-engineered? And I'll give you a little perspective on this. You've heard both these gentlemen talk a little bit about modular designs and where those designs are going, and higher density and higher power and cooling, but maybe less space. All of this is driving the engineering, whether it's a current facility and you're upgrading or maintaining your next pass on your current facility, whether it's a new facility, you have to look at that engineering and where it's at, right? And some things that kind of happen in the industry that we've seen from ours as an outsider looking in. You may engage an external engineering firm. Well, that engineering firm typically will recommend to you what they're most comfortable with. But what they're most comfortable with may not be what you need. So that's a little flag or a little thing for you to look at from a facility standpoint. As you engage that engineering firm, make sure it meets what you want. The other thing, of course, is engineering firms are compensated by what? How much work they do, okay? So do you need the Cadillac or do you need the Chevy with all the options in your data center? Which one is going to function properly? Kind of think in that mentality. Now, you need the expertise of those engineering firms, but you don't necessarily have to spend way up here. You can maybe spend what's appropriate. And I'm not talking about value engineering where you take the critical things out. I'm talking about looking at the level that you're at. And the third thing I would tell you to look at when it comes to engineering is, do you need to build out that whole facility right now? The shell of the facility is the least inexpensive component, right? It's all of your power, cooling, and your infrastructure that you put into that facility. And when you do that, you need to meet certain requirements, but maybe you don't want to spend the cash flow or make that transition for another 3 or 5 years to add additional infrastructure from power and cooling. Why? Servers 10 years ago were yay big, right? Servers today are the size of a laptop or smaller. Who's to say that in another 5 years, servers aren't going to be the size of your phone? And every one of your phones in this room has more compute capacity than servers had 5 years ago. So be careful when you go to build out. Don't build all of it out, build out what's appropriate and use that through kind of a modular format. I think you've heard both these gentlemen talk about modular several times through here. So I'm going to kind of turn it over. Maybe Steve Smith, why don't you go ahead and start with this
I
one?
like your analogy of the Chevy versus the Cadillac. And when you think about going to the car dealership, I don't think there's anybody in the room that would go to a car dealership and ask the dealer to spec you a vehicle. But we do that with engineering a lot, don't we? We go to an electrical engineer and I need a power plant and here's kind of what I think I'm going to get into long-term down the road. Well, if they can sell a lot of time and a lot of services, you can wind up with a monster that you never use. Expandability in place, maintainability in place are super important considerations. And building out as you need with a mind to, if I need to, let's pick on a PDU for instance. If you buy a Liebert PDU that has expansion capabilities, it's got a couple of 225 amp breakers in the front of it. When you build that and you put it in, if you don't put in a couple of leads from those breakers to a box under the floor where you can safely attach and extend, you have to shut that thing down to expand, right? So I'm going to add an expansion cabinet 3 years down the road, and I've got my critical infrastructure running off of it. Do we try to get in there amongst all those hot connections and hook this up? Well, OSHA says no. Common sense definitely says no. But the pre-planning of a few $1,000s spent adding in a junction box under the floor with some wiring that lands on a termination point so that you can add an expansion cabinet down the road was inexpensive up front, and you didn't buy the expansion cabinet day one, but you can still safely hook it up. So that kind of a thought process in design and in long-term planning and expandability, the ability to take a facility and duplicate it over as you need space. Once you hit a certain megawatt or a certain watt density that you know you're going to approach filling this up in 3 years, okay? So if you look at build outs from a perspective of 6 months design, 12 months build, you need to be at least 1.5 years in front of it. How far do you have to be in front of that for budgeting? Start with the end in mind, work your way back to the logical physical starting point, and that will tell you how far out you need to be planning for expansion.
Steve, would you like to share a little bit of yours? We talked about some significant changes when virtualization came into your facility and how you had to re-engineer some things.
Sure. When we, especially when we came up with the 3,000 square foot for the second, or what I'd call our newer data center of 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of discussions. We sat down with facilities. What can we do with this? Well, what is our goal? What is the size of the data center going to be? How many kW is it going to be? Well, I wanted it as much as possible. Well, how much power is coming into the building? How much cooling can we provide in that room? How do we stop from putting all of the UPSs and crack units in the room, making it, oh, super data center, but no room for racks, no room for the computers? All I was interested in is room for those computers. Working together with facilities and the engineering firm, we discovered that the generator that we wanted to put on the roof, we thought, well, all right, we're going to go for 8 kW per cabinet. We need a 1 megawatt generator. Can't put it up on the penthouse, the whole building will shake. So that, we then kind of reverse engineered it. What can we do? Well, we know that currently we got 3 to 5 kW as most of our cabinets. Most of them will be that. We'll have some rows where just isolation, and then we'll have total containment with 11K cabinets, and that's how we came to our solution, kind of back end after we found out what you can do. But certainly modular, I went with modular, a more expensive UPS solution, but 25K modules start at 100. You can ramp that up to 250. I'm still not at 250 on 2 of those units, and only just recently added as we got more into high-performance compute clusters, so that we just watch that utilization, keeping that under 40% for our redundancy, for our AV redundancy, and that has made sense. We've already done a battery cycle. I would have had batteries in those units that I'd thrown out that I never needed the 35 minutes of runtime on. So watching that, working collaboratively with a facility department to find out what is the max that we can go, and then designing to that.
And the point that Steve made here that's very clear, and I know we talk a lot with our clients, I know there's some of you in the room that have heard this over and over, is build what you need today, but plan what you need in the future, right? And then you can add on. So as he's talking about, as his power goes up, he can add another UPS, okay? He doesn't have to do it the same. So now it's back to that budgeting of the compute's going to add this, but we need this for the extra additional power on the UPS side. But you don't have to buy it all up front. If you look at some of the newer designs today that are out there, you can buy it when you need it. And a huge unknown for all of us is what's going to happen to the compute infrastructure in 3, 4, or 5 years. Nobody knows, right? I mean, you're lucky if you can figure out what the compute's going to be in 2 years or 3 years, let alone 5 years from now. Where on facilities we're spending and depreciating over 10 years, 15 years time period. So, last statement that's up here. This actually relates to all the slides, and we're going to finish with this, and then we're going to open it up for any last questions that you have. But do we plan and understand the impacts? Do we understand the impacts of the compute architecture changing and consolidation and virtualization? Do we understand the funding aspects of it? Do we understand the security requirements and the impacts? Do we understand how this rolls up into engineering? There's a reason that's the last question, as you can see. So we kind of want to open it up there. I'm going to let Steve and Steve answer that, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
Go ahead.
Do we over-engineer? The tendency is to do that. I'd say in the past, if you look at data centers, even my older one, maybe utilizing it 40%, optimizing is a key. I don't want to come through with the new IT vice president and tell them that, yeah, we've got half of our space is open, but we're out of cooling and we're out of power. You don't want to have that conversation. When you tell them that, look, we're replacing things, we're taking out the old inefficient servers and we're replacing them, we've virtualized servers, that changes the discussion completely. I've seen where they buy in, we do a phase then for let's continue to do this with power, let's migrate the power, let's do better airflow, let's clean that power out from under the floor and move it above. Produced way better airflow for cooling, but also caused us to look at every cabinet, some of which, I admit, I disconnected the Ethernet. I didn't unplug it because I was afraid it wouldn't spin the hard drives back up, 10-year-old servers. I couldn't figure out, and I'm the data center manager for 12 years, who owns this equipment? So, yes, you do. That is a waste of money, and maybe you can consider that over-engineered. As you move towards optimizing, you can regain physical space, and you can definitely get better value for your money.
Great.
Steve, a little bit on the impacts you've seen.
Well, from my perspective, I cannot manage what I do not measure. So we use trending. We're going to trend UPS load. We're going to trend our cooling load. We're going to trend rack unit utilization as a percentage of the total rack units available across the entire floor. And we do it over a period of years. So when I look at growth, if I look at the last 10 years of what does this linear growth look like, I can extrapolate out points in time that says here's where I'm probably going to be in the future. And I've used it for a long time. It's always held pretty true. Typically, say we're a mainframe shop, we're probably not going to change that immediately. If we do change that, we've got to back up and punt and figure out what that really looks like. And that would be fairly challenging. That would be very tough. But to use trending and look at where you're headed in the future, you have the ability to say, I know that in a year and a half, I'm going to be at capacity on this UPS. It's time to do something with it. And if you start buildings day one modularly and expandable in place, and you trim that as you go, it's going to tell you when you need to buy a UPS module. That trending is going to tell you when you need to add cooling to the raised floor because you're approaching 100% of your existing cracks, and you're approaching getting into your additional redundant unit, right? Need 3, got 4. Once 3 are full, it's time to add another one because you're going to be using number 4 next week, right? So paying attention to trending, paying attention to metrics, having good metrics, I think are of utmost importance to keep you from overbuilding. But you also got to have that conversation with the infrastructure folks so you understand really what does the future look like. Are we ever going to go away from this kind of architecture? Are we looking at anything different? Could I expect my environment to dramatically change in the next year, 3 years, 5 years down the road?
So the metrics and measurement help you understand the impacts, what you're really getting at there.
Some insight, right?
So we've got about 5 minutes left. We're just going to open it up for any general questions at this point in time. So any questions that you may have, we're happy to try to address them. Anybody have any questions on the... Mike?
Do you have any cost allocation process? I mean, when your customers come to you for a new installation, do you give them a cost estimate?
While I think that's a great metric, I don't actually have a chargeback model.
How about you, Steve Hawley? Do you use a chargeback model?
I do. When we went into the high performance compute cluster and that whole field, I realized that was going to touch everything: facilities, us. It's not just the 15 Dell servers and the GPU unit, but I had to talk to the vendor on the cabinet. I see him sitting in here. How can we're going to actually put 10 kW or better in this cabinet now. We designed for it. Now it's got to work. What do I have to watch out for? What do I have to do with that? There was costs with that. I had to seal the cabinet 100% and make sure it was sealed up. I had to add modules to the UPS because when we did some testing, we saw that we were approaching 47, 48%. You'd hate to be running a high performance compute and then take down your data center because of some other failure of one side or the other of power. We had to add power modules. We had to look at the cooling. Luckily, we didn't have to change anything with the crack units. We could control it in the cabinet by putting in larger fans and sealing up the cabinets. But yes, there was a significant cost that they were quite surprised to see what those power modules are in the UPS and the engineering of the cabinets and some other hidden things, the big picture, and we did give them that price, so there wasn't any surprises.
Yeah, in the past, I have individualized the expenses of installation for managers so they know what the things that they're doing cost. And it'll make a difference on the kind of architecture they buy, whether they're looking at 25 or 50 1U servers versus a virtual appliance. The cost is averaging $500 a drop. You're going to get 2 drops per cabinet. It's going to be this many cabinets. This is the man hours to rack stack and cable up that many devices versus how much it is to rack stack and cable up a single virtual device. And it really kind of starts to come into the picture for them that maybe I need to think about this differently. Am I being a good steward of the company's resources and the company's money? Am I really doing the best thing from an expense perspective? And a lot of people that are in IT infrastructure and responsible for equipment procurement do not understand really what it costs to put that on the floor. They don't understand how much a square foot is my facility worth. What did it cost day one? Add in all the upgrades that we've done over the years. How much square foot is it really worth now? And is it worth filling up 5 racks versus 1? And how do we manage the company's money so that we can use those dollars for better investments that bring in a better return somewhere else? And if it comes down to saying this much is required for the installation of this equipment, and before I sign the ticket for installation, I need you to approve it, just for knowledge base, not necessarily that I'm going to back charge you, but just so we all know. They'll look at it, and the next time they'll make a little different decision that's a little better for the overall business, hopefully.
So the key, as Steve Smith is bringing up, is you have to understand your current costs before you can get into a cost allocation model. And I will tell you, most of the clients that we work with, they understand their current day operating cost today. What does it cost to run that data center? But is that data center going to continue to run at that same operating cost 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road? No, you're going to have to spend capital to replace that equipment. So be sure you include your future capital investments in your model as you start to allocate the costs, or somebody's going to come along and you're going to say, I need $10 million to replace crack unit, or I need $30 million to replace XYZ, and you don't have allocation for it. Now what are you going to do, right? So you have to take into account the capital costs that go in with those operating costs. Don't just focus on what does it cost to run today, what's it going to cost to keep it running is the key there. Probably have time for one last question. Anybody have one more question? If not, we'll finish. Oh, one question in the back.
Yes, you've talked in a lot of general terms about metrics and being able to determine what it's going to cost to serve someone who's putting servers in your facility. Now, for general facility operations, we know that we can tie costs generally back to head count or square footage of occupancy. But in an IT facility, it's related to power consumption, cooling needs, and a whole host of other characteristics of that particular IT equipment. Does anybody have any ideas about what you might start using as a metric to actually give somebody a true cost allocation for their services and needs?
I can answer that.
I would break that down to cost per rack unit. I would probably break that down to a cost per rack unit, and further driving consolidation and virtualization and encouraging people to use the least amount of space, the least amount of power, most benefit.
They can consolidate into a really small server space. It consumes a lot of power and a lot of cooling. They got you, right?
But that's your total energy cost for that facility. And divided by all the rack units, yeah, somebody else is going to pay a little more if they have a little less dense environment. But is that really a problem for you? You know, the reason that I ask that is, do you charge back? Do you have a chargeback model? Is that the driver?
Right now, I'm not sure how our facility actually arranges for a true cost allocation of chargeback.
Okay.
I don't know if it's square footage or if it's power consumption or maybe a combination of both. But I would, if I were strategizing on how to take the maximum benefit, I would be thinking if you go high density, most facility managers you're going to get a better value from most facility managers to go with high density than you would because you're taking up less space, and that's how typically managers think of cost is your footprint.
And I would tend to agree with you there. I would also tell you that as they virtualize and consolidate into newer equipment, your work per watt goes up. And whereas you might originally have the thought process of, well, they went from 5 racks down to 1 rack and they've got me, if they're utilizing that equipment to its potential, you're going to get more work out of it for less dollars. So they're indirectly and inadvertently probably helping the company more than they've got anybody.
So I'll just give you a quick overview. So our organization, we help companies go to a shared service and go to that allocation, and I could spend 2 hours explaining that question, but it's really 3 key components. You have to start with a service catalog. So what are going to be those shared services you're going to apply? Within that service, then there are the IT and facility components that build up the service. So how many virtual servers, how much storage, how much power, how much cooling, et cetera. Then you have to understand your current cost, and you have the cost building blocks down below. It might be cost per gigabyte for storage. It might be cost per watt for a virtual session, or it might be cost per virtual session for a server component. And you put those building blocks together because the building blocks match the equipment you need up above that then determines the cost of that service. And then when something changes, you go higher, denser, lower density, you're only changing those 2 or 3 building blocks. You're not changing the whole model. So you can actually manage it from year to year to year. A lot of people build very complicated shared services, service catalogs, and chargeback models, but then they're super complicated to update the next year and they disappear. So you've got to keep it somewhat simplistic, where you only change what changes. And that's really the philosophy behind building that type of structure.
My
Each
experience
piece
so
has a
far
different
in-
metric.
Sorry.
Yep, go ahead.
My experience so far, anytime someone has taken physical servers off the raised floor and virtualized, I show an overall drop in KW. It may be 1, 3, 5, 7 KW. It's not huge, but it's a drop.
Yeah, the example I gave earlier of the 74 racks, it was 74 racks at 3.5 kW, so it was roughly 220 kW consolidated into 1 rack with 3 kW power supply. So it was 9, we went from 220 kW to 9 kW for handling 1,200 servers. So your cost per server per power dropped drastically. Now, I'm going to clarify, this client had 5,000 servers and we could only do that with 1,200 of the 5,000. The other ones couldn't move that way, right? So you can't do that for everything. It only fits in certain situations, in certain scenarios. So you have to understand that as well.
Yeah. And with a chargeback model, boy, did you just incentivize everybody else.
Oh yeah, huge,
Right.
huge incentive. Okay? I think that's it for time. Thank you all for attending. And obviously we will be around. If you have other questions, we'd be happy to speak with you one-on-one as well.